Get ready to rock radio, music you want to hear.
And we're saying hello now, a very warm welcome to Get Ready to Rock to the custodian of the flame, keeper of the flame, and brother, tour manager, very close obviously to the great Rory Gallagher, and that's Donal Gallagher. Hello, Donal.
Hi there, Dave.
Nice to talk to you.
Thank you.
And the occasion on which we're speaking is the reissue of the Polydor albums, the 6 albums in the 1970s. How do you view these now in retrospect, Donal, in terms of Rory's output over the years? Because I reckon these are pretty much the definitive albums. What's your take on that?
Well, they're very much the cornerstones of the foundations of his work, really, because it was his output after Taste, which was, was a very, in retrospect, a very short-lived period with effectively 2 studio albums. But this was Rory as his own man, his compositions, his own production, by and large, and it's a mixture of the live work and studio work. So it and a very prolific period for Rory. If you think that the space of we're talking 71 to 74, that Rory produced 6 albums. That's 2 albums a year. I think it was very much shock to Polydor, the record company at that time, that he was out of contract before they knew it, before they even knew what they had going. And it stands the test of time that. Well, they're now released on Sony.
That's right. Now, technically, what's been added to these reissues? Because listeners will be maybe aware of the various reissues over the years, and there were several in the late 90s which sounded pretty good to my ears anyway. What would you say has been added to the latest batch of reissues in terms of the technical? Because you sat in on this, didn't you? And,
yes, I did.
Yeah.
Well, the ones that came out posthumously for Rory were it's the ever-changing technologies, and you're very much the mid-90s, post-mid-90s was the sort of digital scenario, where we went back to the multi-tracks, and they were effectively remixes or takes at that time to see what was hidden in there. So we used the original engineers, and then we'd also brought in other engineers to help with that at this time. In more recent times, my son, who was a guitar player, Daniel, he had his own band, the Gazelles. He's now with Strange Music full time. He was working on the vinyl reissues, so this is how this came about. So he'd gone back to the original mixes, and he looked at the mixes we had done, and he favoured Rory's own original mixes. And there was an element of what might be done to celebrate the 40 years since they had been first issued as albums. So effectively, Daniel took it on himself to go in the studio with Rory's original mixes, but then apply, not change the mixes, but apply the technology to obviously enhance the quality of the recordings to today's standards that are there.
Yes. I mean, I have to say they do sound very, very crisp and clear, and I suppose you could say very much of the time, but enhanced by the progress of time, really.
Yeah. I mean, technology is sort of quantum leaping itself all the time, so there's always more that can be got out of. But we're in the fortunate position of being able to go back to the original audio tape, the analog tape itself, and we've preserved them. We've always sort of prided ourselves in looking after Rory's work in its original form and being able to access that. Whereas we know of a lot of artists, and in fact some of the major record companies, where they've either disposed of the tape or they've in fact lost it, and stuff that was put into, a lot of people thought at the time, a CD. Well, that's it. It's stored forever in digital. Well, digital doesn't deteriorate; it just corrupts. So, in this case, we felt that if we really wanted to be true to the original releases, was to go back to those original mixes, the way Rory wanted them to sound, because he was fairly meticulous and very particular about the mixes, even though I was Rory's, did the mixes out front in the live studio, in the live gigs and stuff. So, and I'd always sort of add my tuppence worth about what I felt he might add, but and to a certain extent I felt he was always being a little bit subtle with his mixes. But and I can now hear, and I've now got my son's argument to say, well, actually, Rory was right. It's me eating humble pie a little bit here.
Yes. So what you're saying, really, Donal, is these reissues are really as Rory would have heard them himself.
Indeed.
Yeah, this is it.
This is radio for the internet age. Get ready to rock radio.
Now, I get the impression that these are very honest albums, the 70s. They're not overproduced, overdubbed. I mean, was Rory pretty much given free rein in the studio?
Yes, he was. I mean, he came, the first album, which is the Rory Gallagher album, he came out of the Taste scenario where they had a producer. There was the constraints of the record company. It was a little bit dictated, and he had riled against that and fought against it. But this is a time period where, for the first time, he didn't have the pressures on him. He was able to go into the studio. He was his own boss. He produced himself, wrote the material, and called the shots. He knew he had a very good contract, because on the final Taste tour there was a band, Stone the Crows, with Maggie Bell, and their co-manager was a guy called Peter Grant, the Zeppelin's manager, and Peter and Rory and I struck up a friendship, and Peter actually assisted in getting Rory the best from a Polydor contract at that time.
Oh, that was great.
And which gave Rory all the complete freedoms he required. And and then, I mean, you have the first Rory Gallagher album, which was a far more lavish studio, to the second album, which is Deuce. And so Rory flirted with, the Advision Studios. It was Tony, it was the engineer who had worked on the Taste on the Boards album, and so he worked with him in that respect, and then went off to Dalston Studios, which was an old reggae studio, which was about to be torn down, which had originally been built by Joe Meek. That's the range of freedom he had. And then, of course, the third album was a live album, and they weren't a fashionable thing to do at that time, live albums, back in 73,
I mean, what was the expectation from the record company Polydor when Rory signed? I mean, were they looking for hit singles?
Well, the potential for Taste to have been the sort of world-beating band was there, and I think it was a little bit. Polydor initially were a bit slow in seeing the merits of Taste, because there was, to be honest, there was so much happening on the scene generally across. The whole thing was exploding in the late '60s. So, and just with, on the boards, I mean, let's not forget it was a top 10 UK album, so they had broken through, and record companies probably weren't as sophisticated as nowadays, and the whole international integration of companies wasn't there. So Tastes were actually bigger in places like Germany and France, I think they had a number one single, much to Rory's disgust, where the German company had put out a single of What's Going On, and it got to number one, and Rory was furious because he didn't want singles. I mean, talked about scoring, trying to score own goals against yourself, but that was the way it was. So that there'd been much confusion with Polydor, and then suddenly the band were on the Isle of Wight festival, and that's the day that it had all fallen apart and they were splitting up.
Now, coming forward to the 70s with these albums then, I mean, it seems you've already referred to this actually, Donal, with the fact that if you leave out the live albums from this series, Rory recorded 4 albums in 4 years, which is pretty good going, given that he was also touring at the time.
Yeah.
How did he ever fit all this in?
Corny phrase 24/7 wouldn't even describe Rory, and at that time my capacity as a tour manager was a nightmare, because you'd be doing a gig in, I remember with Juice, the Juice album, sort of finishing a gig at midnight in Southend, getting all the gear packed up, arriving at Dalston at 2 a.m. And loading in, and Rory started recording, because he was also looking to get the live adrenaline effect into the studio recordings. He wanted everybody to play together, and he felt how better than sort of coming off the stage, and it was like going back on for an encore when you got in the studio. So he'd worked through the night. I mean, there was little or no sleep. And plus the fact Rory himself then was sort of doing the promotion and interviews on top of everything else.
We'll move forward to Blueprint in 1973, and we're going to play a track off that called Hands Off. Now, what was the reason for the introduction of keyboards, with Lou Martin joining the band for this album?
Well, Rory had sort of wanted to get a kind of rhythm into the band. He had always favoured the idea of having a rhythm guitarist, believe it or not, and had kind of coached me as a youngster to try and get me to learn guitar and play. He kind of liked he always used to say to me, he'd much prefer a good rhythm player to a good lead player. He enjoyed, and he had been looking for that. Also, the idea, he only really wanted to have keyboards on 1 or 2 tracks, or to give another dimension. So Lou Martin, in fact, had the reputation that he could play guitar as well. So, and Lou Martin had been in a band with Rod Diaz, a band called Killing Floor. And ironically, the bass player Jerry McAvoy had gone looking for a flat rental and ended up sharing with these guys who were also in the band. So that's how that connection was made. So they used to talk about Lou. So Roy then said, "Well, let's see how we can get on with Lou." And they did an Italian tour, and Lou was given a guitar to sort of see what how his chord structure was, and do a couple of numbers on piano and stuff like that. But his keyboard skills were fantastic. So it sort of, the guitar was left to one side, and then with the progression in the types of keyboards, the technology where you could get an organ sound without having to carry a Hammond and Leslie, even though we ended up doing that anyway. But keyboards became more sophisticated, so you could get a range of color into the. I suppose Rory felt it maybe filled up some gaps or holes in what he felt the sound was.
Get ready to rock radio.
Now, what happened then after the last Polydor album, Tattoo, in 1974? You hinted a bit earlier, actually, Donal, saying that he was out of contract, but why did he split from Polydor?
Well, I think they were taken by surprise that he was even out of contract. I don't think they even realised. I think it was largely because Polydor had set up themselves up in America and took back the contract from Atlantic, because the first 2 albums of Rory, the Rory Gallagher and Juice, had gone out in Atlantic and had done quite well. Polydor then, by the time Live in Europe came along, had set up Polydor America, Polydor Inc., and took back the contract. but weren't able to step up to the plate in terms of promotion, even though, in fairness, they probably felt they were doing their best, but they weren't up to speed like the other US companies. And by the time Irish Tour came, I think Rory felt that despite all the touring he had done, they really hadn't done the job for him. And also there was a time where I think they probably thought, well, there are a lot of guitar players out there, and they didn't respect Rory probably to the extent that they, at that time. Also, by the end of '74 into '75, that's when the Rolling Stones were looking for Rory to join after the departure of Mick Taylor at the very end of '74. We had just finished another Irish tour, as it were. So, and we were at home in Ireland, and the phone rang, and it was the Stones looking to know if Rory would go and sit in with them in Holland, which he did for 4 or 5 nights in Rotterdam, and recorded with them, and that was the start of the Black and Blue album. But Rory already had commitments in Japan, which there was, so he was very much in demand, and then wanted to keep his freedom because, so it wasn't until '75 that Chrysalis, they presented probably what at that time seemed to be the best contract, and at that time Chrysalis Records were distributed and were a label on Warner Brothers, and Warner Brothers were very keen to sign Rory because they had seen Rory on the big tours in America, like the Deep Purple's tour, and there was one with Fleetwood Mac, and Rory was winning over audiences every night, so Warner was very conscious of him. So, it seemed a positive move at that time.
Get ready to rock radio, music you want to hear.
Now, what was the what do you think was the biggest disappointment for Rory, if I can put it like that, in terms of, before his sad death in the mid 1990s? I mean, what were the longer term plans? Because in that period, the early 1990s, there was a revival of interest in blues rock with musicians like the late Jeff Healey and the late now Gary Moore. Was Rory aware that he should have been part of that, if I can call it a bandwagon? It was a revival, really. But of course his health must have been failing at that time.
Yes, it was to a certain extent, and I think he had really overworked himself, and going back to the overused word of workaholic. I mean, he where he was producing, he was writing. He was, even though I was doing the management at that time, effectively Rory was his own manager. So you were just trying to be a good officer and carry out his wishes, really. You were running the office to suit his needs. So he didn't take a break. He didn't take holidays. I think he felt that he'd put so much effort. If there was any disappointment, it would have been the States, because he had done 25 tours. He had, in effect, done to a large extent what was asked of him by the record companies, and they didn't deliver in the same way you would see bands that, were just getting their first album, and, there was sort of millions of dollars of promotion being thrown at it.
Yes.
And we saw it very much in Chrysalis as well, where other bands were just, they were just being signed up for a lot of money, and I think it was almost our own mistake that we were too hard working, is that they felt, oh well, there's no need to spend money on those guys because they're doing every venue, east to west coast, north to south, it's self-promoting. We don't have to worry about those guys, and they paid more attention. So it was, the squeaky wheel getting the oil all the time, and I think that was a frustration for Rory in that respect. However, in the last lineup he had, with David Levy on bass, and Richard Newman and Mark Felton, which I feel was really showing huge promise. I mean, I think that band was, and he was getting into it and was getting in the studio and recording, and there were lots of possible collaborations. Possibly one with Dylan was on the cards. Yes, you had all these new blues guys on the block, but but no more than at a time when Rory could have gone down, and I remember the record company saying, "Why don't you become more like a heavy metal band?" And because in fact Rory had created so many of the guitar riffs that are used in the heavy metal bands, and all, be it the Judas Priest, they always pay homage to Rory. In fairness, all these bands, Def Leppard, and they all rate Rory, and he could have gone. So as soon as somebody would say to Rory, the new trend is back to the blues, Rory would go the opposite direction and say, well, I'm doing a folk album then. Because that's what he did. He was going off to make a folk album. So he just didn't want to be pigeonholed or labelled in any kind of way. And but that said, if you look, here we are 40 years on from the first albums, I mean, and they're still out there. They're still, creating their own new excitement to a new generation, hopefully.
Yeah, and it must hearten you when musicians cite Rory and their influences. You've already mentioned the likes of Def Leppard. So many bands, actually, guitar players, The Edge, Gary Moore as well. I mean, anyone who's played blues into rock, really. Are there any particular artists you'd recommend who you think most closely capture his spirit and legacy?
Well, I've huge respect for Johnny Marr. I mean, but Johnny does his own thing. I mean, but as a human being, I think if there's and equally in recent times, I met Joe Bonamassa, who invited me to his gig at the Apollo in London, and I know full well Johnny Marr called me on a mobile one day and asked if he could meet me, and I know when it's the guitar players, not really me, they want the rub of a relic of, as much as they want to hold Rory's Strat. So that's a great kick and a great pleasure. In the case of Joe Bonamassa, he then asked if he could open his set with Rory's Strat, and he opened the set with Cradle Rock, and that was tremendous. Whether it's the DNA in the guitar or whatever comes out of the thing, and certainly Joe's personality is a very decent person, and not least his girlfriend Sandy Tom, who is another wonderful guitar player. A huge admiration for is Brian May. Brian, in fact, when Brian used to live or in Bedsits, a couple of doors away from where Taste were staying, in Phil Beach Gardens in Earls Court, and his band was Smile at that time, and I remember Brian turning up at the Marquee and asking if he could meet Rory, and they were friends ever since. So then Brian said he was hoping that his band Smile would get a couple of opening slots with Rory at some point, and anyway, as luck had it, they did, and I remember Brian coming up and asking me and saying, "Well, look, do you think Rory does sound checks? Would he come a bit early?" He said, "We have a new singer, and I'd love Rory to hear him." And so it was the Technical Institute up in Dunstable. So Rory, who didn't particularly do sound checks at that time, it was very much off the cuff, said, "Well, yeah, I'll go along early and I can change my strings and hang out." And that was one of the first gigs with Freddie. And Brian came running in after they'd finished their set and looking for Rory to know what Rory's comments were. And Rory said, "Hey, I reckon you got a new Little Richard on your hands here."
Now, finally, could we just... this is quite a big question and it puts you on the spot a little bit, but it's an obvious one. Have you got your own personal favourite album of Rory's, and why is that?
Oh, goodness. Are we talking about the 6?
Well, yes, let's focus in on the 6, because it makes it easier, doesn't it?
Well, can I have two?
Yes, you can.
Well, I suppose the two live albums because in a way they're performances which have some tracks obviously from the albums, and because of what it conjures up. I mean, when Rory went in the studio, I was sort of kept outside a little bit, but I suppose from the live point of view that I feel I have a larger contribution in that respect. So I suppose I leaned down on the two live albums a little bit.
They mean a bit more, don't they, because of your involvement, I suppose, naturally. It's funny because I was thinking of a live track to end our chat, Donal, and I'm looking at Irish Tour 74. Is there a particular track on that you'd like us to play? What about Back on My Stomping Ground?
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, I mean, I think that sums it up. It was after hours and that was recorded in Cork, so it was back in his hometown and back in the stomping ground.
Thank you, Donal, for your time talking to Get Ready to Rock, and all the best with your projects in the coming months.